Welcome, and thank you for joining me tonight for another restful story from long ago. As the world outside grows still, I invite you to slow down and settle in for a soft journey through history's quieter corners. Tell me, if you'd like, where are you listening from, and what time is it right now? It's a lovely thought, all of us scattered across time zones, sharing this moment. If you enjoy falling asleep to stories like this, consider subscribing. There's so much more we'll uncover together in the nights to come. But first, let me paint you a picture that will make everything else crystal clear. Imagine walking down Chitpur Road in 1860. The monsoon has just ended, leaving pools of stagnant water everywhere. You're trying to navigate through narrow lanes filled with human shapes lying motionless against crumbling walls. Some are breathing, some aren't. And here's the terrifying part. You can't tell which is which until you get close enough to smell the difference between opium, stupor, and death. My name is your guide through one of history's darkest chapters. And what I'm about to share with you isn't just another history lesson. This is the untold story of how an entire city became a graveyard for the living, where colonial greed created a perfect storm of addiction and disease that claimed hundreds of thousands of lives. The evidence I've uncovered will show you that this wasn't just a tragic accident of history. It was systematic, it was deliberate, and the consequences were absolutely devastating. Now you might be thinking, this is just another story about the evils of colonialism. But what makes this different is how these two crises amplified each other in ways that nobody talks about. When you have thousands of opium addicts lying unconscious in the streets, and then cholera starts spreading through contaminated water sources, you don't just get two separate problems. You get something far worse. Let me introduce you to Ramesh Chandra, a Bengali clerk who worked for a British trading house in 1858. Ramesh kept a diary, and his entries from that year read like something from a horror novel. On July 15th, he wrote, "Stepped over 3 bodies on my way to work today. Could not tell if they were sleeping or dead until the flies gave them away." 3 days later, "The smell in Bow Bazaar has become unbearable. The opium eaters no longer move when you approach them." But Ramesh's story gets worse. By August, he was writing about his own brother, Suresh, who had started visiting the opium dens near the docks. Suresh came home today, but his eyes were like glass. He spoke to people who were not there and laughed at things that were not funny. "Mother is weeping." This wasn't just happening to poor dock workers or street beggars. The opium crisis was cutting through every level of Bengali society like a plague. Wealthy merchants, government clerks, teachers, craftsmen, they were all falling into the same trap. And here's what makes this story even more tragic. Many of them turned to opium because they were already suffering from the economic devastation that British policies had brought to Bengal. See, the British had systematically destroyed local industries. Textile workers who had been making fine cotton and silk for centuries suddenly found themselves competing with machine-made goods from Manchester. Farmers who had grown food crops for local markets were forced to grow indigo and other cash crops for export. When people's livelihoods disappeared, opium became an escape from a reality that offered no hope. But the British weren't just passive observers of this tragedy. They were actively profiting from it. The East India Company had a complete monopoly on opium production in Bengal, and they were making astronomical profits by selling it to China. But here's the part that will shock you. They were also selling it locally in Calcutta, right in their own administrative capital. Picture this. British officials would spend their days writing reports about law and order, about civilizing the natives, about bringing progress to India. Then they would go home to their comfortable bungalows while the streets outside were literally carpeted with opium addicts. The hypocrisy was staggering, but it gets worse. Dr. William O'Shaughnessy, an Irish physician working in Calcutta during this period, wrote extensively about what he witnessed. In his medical reports from 1859, He described scenes that sound like something from Dante's Inferno. The opium smokers lie in rows like corpses in a morgue, he wrote. Their breathing is so shallow that one must watch carefully to distinguish the living from the dead. The proprietors of these establishments care little for such distinctions, as both categories occupy the same amount of space and generate the same revenue. O'Shaughnessy was documenting something that the colonial government preferred to ignore. The opium dens weren't just places where people went to smoke. They had become human warehouses where addicts would lie for days at a time, their bodies shutting down while their minds floated in narcotic dreams. The den operators would charge by the day, and they didn't particularly care whether their customers ever left. But then cholera arrived, and everything got exponentially worse. Cholera spreads through contaminated water, and Victorian Calcutta was basically designed for cholera outbreaks. The city had grown rapidly around the British commercial district, but there was no proper sewage system, no clean water supply for most residents, and no waste management to speak of. When you added thousands of opium addicts lying motionless in the streets, unable to maintain basic hygiene or move away from contaminated areas, you created the perfect breeding ground for disease. Let me tell you about what happened in the Burra Bazaar area in the summer of 1860. This was one of the most densely populated commercial districts in Calcutta, filled with narrow lanes, crowded tenements, and dozens of opium dens. When cholera hit this neighborhood, it spread like wildfire through a tinderbox. Madhav Sen was a spice trader who lived in Burra Bazaar with his family. His account of those weeks reads like a chronicle of the apocalypse. The disease moved from house to house like an invisible demon, he wrote. In the morning, you would see your neighbor hanging laundry. By evening, his family would be burning his body by the river. But here's where the opium crisis made everything worse. The addicts couldn't run. When cholera broke out in a neighborhood, healthy people would flee to stay with relatives in other parts of the city. But the opium smokers were physically incapable of moving. They lay in the same spots where they had been smoking, drinking the same contaminated water, breathing the same infected air, while cholera tore through their weakened bodies. Madhav described seeing entire opium dens that had become morgues overnight. 20 men had been lying there for days, lost in their dreams. When the sickness came, they died without ever waking up. Their bodies remained in the same positions, as if they were still sleeping. The colonial authorities tried to downplay the crisis, but the numbers were impossible to hide. British medical officers estimated that cholera killed over 60,000 people in Calcutta between 1860 and 1862. But those numbers didn't account for the opium addicts who died in the streets and were never officially recorded. Local Bengali sources suggest the real death toll was much higher. What makes this story even more heartbreaking is how families were torn apart. Let me tell you about Kamala Devi, a widow who ran a small textile shop in the Shambazar area. Her teenage son, Gopal, had started visiting opium dens after losing his job at a cotton mill that couldn't compete with British imports. Kamala spent months searching for Gopal in the maze of dens throughout the city. She would walk through these hellish places, stepping over unconscious bodies, looking for her son's face among the living dead. In her letters to her sister in Dhaka, she described scenes that would haunt anyone. Mothers sitting beside their sons, not knowing if they are alive or dead. Children as young as 12 lying next to men of 60, all lost in the same terrible sleep. When cholera reached Shambazar, Kamala finally found Gopal. But by then, he was too weak to recognize her. He died in her arms 3 days later, another victim of the double catastrophe that was consuming Calcutta. The British response to all of this was typically colonial. They blamed the victims. Official reports talked about the natural tendency of the Bengali character toward excess, and the unfortunate inability of the native population to maintain proper sanitation. They conveniently ignored their own role in creating both crises, but some British officials couldn't stomach the hypocrisy. Captain Henry Ramsay, a military officer stationed in Calcutta, wrote a scathing report to his superiors in London. "We have created a system that profits from human misery on an unprecedented scale. We grow the opium, we sell the opium, we license the dens, we collect the taxes, and then we express surprise when the streets fill with the dying." Ramsay's report was buried by the colonial administration, but copies survived in private letters. His description of the Tiretta Bazaar area during the height of the crisis is particularly haunting. The line between the living and the dead has ceased to exist. Bodies lie in doorways for days before anyone realizes they have stopped breathing. The smell of death mingles with the sweet smoke of opium until you cannot distinguish between them. This wasn't just happening in the poorest neighborhoods. The opium crisis had spread to middle-class areas as well. Wealthy Bengali families found themselves dealing with addicted relatives who would sell family jewelry, furniture, even clothing to buy their next dose. When cholera struck these households, the addicts became vectors for spreading the disease to their own families. The story of the Mukherjee family illustrates this tragedy perfectly. Prasanta Mukherjee was a successful lawyer who lived in a large house in the Bhawanipur area with his wife, 3 children, and his younger brother, Bijoy. Bijoy had started using opium after losing his teaching position when the British closed several Bengali language schools in favour of English medium institutions. Prasanto tried everything to help his brother recover. He hired doctors, sent Bijoy to relatives in distant villages, even had religious ceremonies performed. But Bijoy always found his way back to the opium dens near College Street. By 1861, he was spending entire weeks away from home, returning only when he needed money or food. When cholera reached Bhawanipur in September of that year, Bijoy was lying unconscious in a den on Beedon Street. The disease spread through the crowded space like fire through dry grass. By the time Prasanto found his brother, Bijoy was burning with fever and delirious. Prasanto brought him home, but it was too late. Within hours, Bijoy had infected his sister-in-law and one of the children. Prasanto's diary entries from those weeks capture the absolute horror of watching cholera tear through an opium-weakened family. Bijoy died this morning, but not before the sickness had taken little rumour as well. My wife grows weaker by the hour. I fear I am watching my entire world collapse, and it all began with that cursed poppy smoke. The British opium trade wasn't just creating addicts. It was creating a population so physically and economically weakened that they became sitting ducks for any epidemic that came along. And the colonial authorities knew exactly what they were doing. Internal East India Company documents from this period reveal the cold calculations behind their policies. A memo from 1859, written by company official Charles Metcalfe, stated, "The consumption of opium among the native population serves multiple administrative purposes. It reduces political agitation, increases tax revenue, and creates a docile workforce dependent upon our continued benevolence." Think about the cynicism of that statement. They were deliberately using addiction as a tool of control, and when disease struck their chemically subdued population, they simply counted the profits from increased opium sales to those trying to escape their suffering. The geography of death in colonial Calcutta tells the whole story. If you mapped out where the opium dens were located and then overlaid that with cholera mortality data, the correlation was almost perfect. The highest death rates occurred in neighbourhoods with the highest concentration of opium addicts. Areas like Chitpur, Burabazar, and Jorasanko became killing fields where addiction and disease fed off each other in an endless cycle of misery. Let me take you inside one of these neighbourhoods during the worst months of the epidemic. Jorasanko was a densely packed area near the river, filled with narrow alleys that barely saw sunlight. The buildings were 3 and 4 stories tall, crammed with families who had migrated from rural areas looking for work in British factories and warehouses. Haripada Ghosh lived in a single room on the 3rd floor of a crumbling tenement with his pregnant wife Sushila and their 2 young daughters. Haripada worked as a porter at the Howrah railway station, but his wages barely covered rent and food. When the British reduced freight operations and laid off half the workforce, Haripada joined the growing ranks of unemployed Bengali men wandering the streets. That's when he discovered the opium den in the basement of a building 3 blocks away. The proprietor, a man named Gokul Chand, had converted what used to be storage space into rows of wooden platforms where customers could lie down and smoke. For 2 annas, you could forget about your empty stomach and your crying children for several hours. Haripada's descent into addiction followed the same pattern as thousands of other men in similar situations. First, he would visit the den only when the desperation became unbearable. Then it became a weekly escape. Within months, he was spending every day lying on those wooden platforms, lost in opium dreams while his family slowly starved. Sushila sold her wedding jewelry to keep the family fed. Then she sold their cooking pots, their winter clothes, even the wooden cot where the children slept. But Haripada kept disappearing into that basement, emerging only to demand more money for his next dose. When cholera hit Jorasanko in October 1861, it spread through the overcrowded tenements like water through a sponge. The disease thrived in the perfect storm of poor sanitation, contaminated water sources, and weakened immune systems. But the opium addicts were hit hardest of all. Gokulchand's basement den became a death trap. The men lying on those wooden platforms were too drugged to notice when cholera symptoms began. They couldn't feel the cramping, couldn't recognize the dehydration, couldn't call for help. They just lay there, slowly dying while lost in narcotic stupors. Sushila found Haripada on one of those platforms 3 days after he had stopped coming home. He was still breathing, but barely. His skin had turned blue-grey, and his eyes had rolled back in his head. She tried to carry him home, but he was too heavy, and she was too weak from hunger and her advancing pregnancy. Haripada died in that basement, surrounded by 20 other men in various stages of opium stupor and cholera infection. Sushila went into labor from the shock and stress. She gave birth to a stillborn son in their empty room while her 2 daughters watched, not understanding why their mother was screaming or why their father never came home. These weren't isolated tragedies. They were happening in every neighborhood, in every social class, across the entire city. The British had created a system that turned human suffering into profit margins, and when that suffering reached epidemic proportions, they simply looked the other way. But some people refused to stay silent. Dr. Mahendra Lal Sircar was one of the first Indian physicians to document the connection between opium addiction and cholera mortality. His 1862 report to the Bengal Medical Society laid out the evidence in stark terms. Neighborhoods with high concentrations of opium dens had cholera death rates 3 times higher than areas without them. Sircar's research showed that opium addicts were not just more likely to contract cholera. They were also more likely to die from it because their bodies were too weakened to fight off the infection. And they were more likely to spread it because they couldn't maintain basic hygiene or isolate themselves when symptoms appeared. The British medical establishment tried to suppress Sircar's findings, but he had documented everything too thoroughly. His patient records included detailed case studies of families destroyed by the dual epidemic. One of his most heartbreaking cases involved the Banerjee family from the Hedua area. Ramkrishna Banerjee had been a successful goldsmith until British industrial policies destroyed the local jewellery trade. Unable to compete with machine-made ornaments imported from Birmingham, Ramkrishna lost his shop and fell into depression. His wife Kamala encouraged him to seek solace at the local temple, but instead he found comfort in the opium den behind the Kali temple on Nimtalagat Road. Within 6 months, Ramkrishna had sold all his goldsmithing tools to buy opium. The family moved from their comfortable house to a single room in a crowded chawl. Kamala took in sewing work to feed their 3 children, but Ramkrishna's addiction consumed every rupee she earned. When cholera reached their neighborhood in the summer of 1862, Ramakrishna was spending 18 hours a day in the opium den. He contracted the disease, but was too drugged to recognize the symptoms or seek treatment. By the time Kamala found him, he had been lying in his own waste for 2 days, surrounded by other sick and dying addicts. Dr. Sircar treated Ramakrishna, but it was too late. The goldsmith died within hours of being brought to the hospital, but the tragedy didn't end there. Kamala had been exposed to cholera while caring for her husband. She fell ill 3 days after his funeral and died within a week, leaving 3 orphaned children. Their eldest son, Gopal, was only 14 years old, but he became the head of the household overnight. He tried to keep his younger siblings alive by begging and doing odd jobs around the docks. But the trauma of watching his parents die, combined with the desperate poverty and social chaos around him, broke something inside the boy. Within a year, Gopal was visiting the same opium den where his father had died. The cycle was beginning all over again, and there seemed to be no way to break it. This was the true horror of what the British had created in Calcutta. Not just a drug epidemic or a disease outbreak, but a self-perpetuating system of human destruction that consumed entire families across generations. The numbers from this period are staggering, but they don't capture the full scope of the catastrophe. Official British records show that cholera killed approximately 60,000 people in Calcutta between 1860 and 1865, but those figures only counted deaths that were officially registered, and most opium addicts who died in the streets were never recorded in any official documentation. Bengali sources suggest the real death toll was much higher. Local newspapers like the Sambad Prabhakar and the Tatwa Bodhini Patrika published their own estimates based on reports from neighborhood leaders and temple priests who were dealing with the bodies. Their numbers suggest that the combined impact of opium addiction and cholera killed over 100,000 people in the greater Calcutta area during those 5 years. But even those numbers don't tell the complete story, because they don't account for the social and economic devastation that rippled out from each death. Every opium addict who died left behind a family pushed deeper into poverty. Every cholera victim who had been caring for addicted relatives left behind people with nowhere to turn for help. The British response to this humanitarian catastrophe was telling. Instead of addressing the root causes, they focused on protecting their own commercial interests and maintaining public order in the areas where Europeans lived. They established cholera hospitals, but only in neighborhoods with significant British populations. They implemented quarantine measures, but only for ships arriving from other ports, not for the disease spreading through Indian neighborhoods. Most revealing of all, they never considered restricting opium sales or closing the dens that were serving as incubators for both addiction and disease. The East India Company was making too much money from the opium trade to let humanitarian concerns interfere with business. The East India Company's internal correspondence from this period reveals just how calculated their indifference really was. In a letter dated March 1863, Company Director James Wilson wrote to the Governor-General, "The mortality rates among the native population, while regrettable, should not be allowed to interfere with our commercial objectives. The opium revenue remains one of our most reliable sources of income, and any restrictions on its sale would be economically catastrophic." Wilson was writing this while bodies were literally piling up in the streets of the city where he lived. Think about that level of moral detachment. These weren't abstract statistics in some distant colony. These were people dying within walking distance of his own mansion in Garden Reach. But let me show you just how twisted this system had become by telling you about Muhammad Yusuf, a Muslim weaver from the Metia Bruise area who got caught in the machinery of British opium policy. Yusuf had been making fine cotton cloth for local markets until British textile imports destroyed his livelihood. Like so many skilled craftsmen, he found himself with no way to support his wife Fatima and their 4 children. The British had established a system of opium licensing that was supposed to regulate the trade. But in reality, it just created more opportunities for corruption and exploitation. Yusuf discovered that he could make money by becoming a small-scale opium dealer, buying from licensed wholesalers and selling to addicts in his neighborhood. At first, Yusuf convinced himself he was just trying to survive in an economy that had been designed to crush people like him. He would buy small quantities of opium paste and sell it to customers who came to his house after dark. The profits were modest, but they kept his family fed when nothing else would. But here's where the British system showed its true evil genius. The licensing fees and taxes were structured in a way that forced small dealers like Yusuf to constantly increase their sales volume just to break even. And the easiest way to increase sales was to create new addicts by offering free samples to desperate people in the neighborhood. Yusuf started giving small amounts of opium to unemployed weavers, telling them it would help with the pain of their situation. Just a temporary escape, he promised. Just something to make the hunger and desperation bearable. Within months, he'd created a dozen new addicts who needed daily doses just to function. The guilt of what he was doing ate away at Yusuf's conscience, and eventually, he started using his own product to numb that guilt. By 1862, he had become one of his own best customers, spending the money he made from selling opium to buy opium for himself. His wife Fatima watched helplessly as her husband transformed from a proud craftsman into a hollow-eyed addict who could barely recognize his own children. When cholera hit Métier Bruce in the autumn of 1862, Yusuf was lying unconscious in the back room of his own house, surrounded by the opium he had been selling. The disease spread through their neighborhood like wildfire, but Yusuf was too drugged to notice when his youngest daughter started showing symptoms. Fatima tried to care for both her husband and her sick child, but she had no medical knowledge and no money for treatment. She watched little Rashida burn with fever, while Yusuf lay motionless just a few feet away, lost in narcotic dreams. The child died calling for her father, but he never woke up to hear her. Fatima's letters to her sister in Murshidabad capture the absolute desperation of those days. "Yusuf breathes, but he is not alive," she wrote. "Rashida is gone, but I cannot even mourn properly, because I must care for the living dead man who was once my husband. The other children ask me when their father will wake up, but I have no answer, because I do not know if he ever will." This was happening in household after household, street after street throughout the city. The British had created a system where people were forced to choose between starvation and participating in their own destruction. And when disease struck, that same system ensured maximum casualties by keeping victims too drugged to seek help or flee to safety. Dr. Surjo Kumar Sen, a Bengali physician who worked in the slums during this period, documented case after case of families torn apart by this double epidemic. His notes from 1863 describe scenes that would horrify anyone with a conscience. In one entry, he wrote about visiting a tenement in Burabazar where an entire family had been wiped out. "I found them all in the same room," Dr. Sen recorded. The father, Nitai Das, was lying on a mat in the corner, an opium pipe still clutched in his hand. His wife was slumped against the wall, her arms around their infant son. Both had clearly died of cholera several days earlier. But the most heartbreaking sight was their 8-year-old daughter, Meera, who was sitting between her dead parents, trying to wake them up. She had been there for 3 days, drinking contaminated water from a clay pot, not understanding that her parents were never going to respond to her cries. Dr. Sen managed to save little Meera, but her story illustrates the broader catastrophe that was unfolding across Calcutta. Children were being orphaned by the thousands, left to fend for themselves in a city where death had become commonplace, and addiction had destroyed the social structures that might have protected them. The British authorities occasionally made gestures toward addressing the crisis, but their solutions revealed how completely they misunderstood what they had created. In 1863, the colonial government announced a program to establish rehabilitation centers for opium addicts. But these centers were essentially prisons where addicts were locked up until they stopped using drugs, with no medical treatment, no counseling, and no support for their families. The program was a complete failure because it ignored the economic desperation that had driven people to opium in the first place. Addicts who completed the program would be released back onto the same streets where they had no jobs, no prospects, and no hope. Most of them were back in their opium dens within days of their release. But the program did serve one purpose for the British. It allowed them to claim they were addressing the problem while continuing to profit from it. Colonial newspapers in London published glowing reports about Britain's humanitarian efforts to help the unfortunate natives overcome their addiction, while conveniently omitting any mention of who was selling them the opium in the first place. Meanwhile, the cholera outbreaks continued to devastate neighbourhoods where opium addiction was highest. The disease had found the perfect environment in these communities of weakened, immobilised people who couldn't maintain sanitation or seek medical care. And each outbreak created more orphans, more widows, more desperate people who turned to opium as their only escape from unbearable circumstances. Let me tell you about Annapurna Devi, a widow from Shambazar, who lost her husband to cholera in 1861. Annapurna was left with 3 young children and no source of income, except for the small amount of rice she could grow on a tiny plot behind their hut. When the rains failed in 1862 and her crop died, she faced an impossible choice: watch her children starve or find some other way to make money. Annapurna started working as a cleaner in one of the opium dens near Chitpur Road. The work was horrifying. She had to clean up after addicts who had lost control of their bodily functions, dispose of bodies that were discovered days after they had died, and maintain some semblance of sanitation in spaces that were designed to house human misery. But the job paid enough to keep her children fed, and Annapurna convinced herself that she was just doing what any mother would do to protect her family. She tried not to think about the fact that her work was helping to maintain a system that was destroying other families just like hers. The owner of the den, a Bengali man named Krishnadan Mukherjee, who had become wealthy by collaborating with the British opium trade, treated Annapurna like a piece of furniture. He would kick her when she didn't clean fast enough, reduce her pay whenever he felt like it, and threaten to fire her if she showed any sign of sympathy for the addicts she was cleaning up after. Krishnadan represented one of the most tragic aspects of the entire system. Indians who had become complicit in their own people's destruction because collaboration with the British offered the only path to survival and prosperity. These men justified their actions by telling themselves they were just businessmen, but they were actually functioning as instruments of colonial policy. Annapurna worked in that hellish environment for 2 years, watching hundreds of men slowly kill themselves with British opium while she cleaned up the mess they made. The psychological toll of that work was enormous, but she endured it because her children needed to eat. Then cholera hit her neighbourhood again in 1864, and this time it took her oldest son, 12-year-old Rahman. The boy had been helping his mother by carrying water and running errands, but he contracted the disease from contaminated water near the opium den where Annapurna worked. Annapurna sat beside Rahman's deathbed, watching him die from the same disease that had killed his father 3 years earlier. But this time, she understood exactly how the system worked. Her son was dying because she worked in a place that created the conditions for disease to spread. Her son was dying because the British had structured the economy so that families like hers had no choice but to participate in their own destruction. The grief and guilt drove Annapurna to start using the opium she cleaned up after at work. At first, she told herself it was just to numb the pain of losing Rahman. But within months, she was spending her wages on opium instead of food for her surviving children. Her 9-year-old daughter, Kamala, tried to take care of her younger brother while their mother lay unconscious for days at a time. The little girl would beg for rice in the market, steal vegetables from carts when she could, and try to keep their hut clean while Annapurna slowly faded away. Dr. Jogesh Chandra Ghosh, who ran a small clinic in Shambazar, encountered the family when Kamala brought her unconscious mother in for treatment. His case notes describe Annapurna as a woman destroyed by circumstances beyond her control, forced into complicity with a system designed to consume people like her. Dr. Ghosh managed to help Annapurna overcome her addiction, but by then, the damage to her family was irreversible. Her youngest son had developed chronic malnutrition from months of inadequate food. Little Kamala had been forced to grow up too quickly, carrying responsibilities no child should bear. And Annapurna herself was broken in ways that went far beyond physical addiction. These individual stories of destruction were playing out across the entire city, but they were also part of a larger pattern of systematic exploitation that extended throughout British-controlled Bengal. The East India Company wasn't just running opium dens in Calcutta. They were operating the entire supply chain, from the poppy fields in rural areas, to the processing centres to the distribution networks that reached into every neighbourhood. The rural areas that grew opium were experiencing their own catastrophes. Farmers who had been forced to replace food crops with poppies were suffering from chronic malnutrition and famine. When cholera spread from the cities to these rural areas, it found populations that were already weakened by hunger and had no economic resources to deal with disease outbreaks. Raghunath Mahato was a farmer from the Nadia district who had been forced to convert his rice fields to poppy cultivation in 1860. The British system worked like this. The company would advance money to farmers for seeds and equipment, then require them to sell their entire crop back to the company at predetermined prices. The farmers had no choice in what they grew or where they sold it. Raghunath discovered that the prices paid for opium barely covered his costs, leaving his family poorer than they had been when they grew food crops. But once he was locked into the system, he couldn't get out. The company held his debt, controlled his land, and dictated what he could plant each season. When his wife Sushila fell ill in 1863, Raghunath had no money for medical treatment because all of his income went to paying off his debt to the company. Sushila died of what was probably cholera, but there was no doctor in their village to confirm the diagnosis or provide treatment. Raghunath's grief and desperation led him to start sampling his own crop. Opium was literally growing in his fields, and it offered temporary relief from the pain of losing his wife and the stress of impossible debt. Within months, he had become addicted to the crop he was forced to grow. The British system had created a perfect trap. Farmers were forced to grow opium, couldn't afford medical care when disease struck their families, and then became addicted to their own crop as a way of dealing with the trauma. Meanwhile, the company collected profits at every stage of the process. When cholera reached Raghunath's village in 1864, he was too drugged to care for his remaining children or maintain his farm. His two sons, ages 10 and 12, tried to keep the family alive by working as day labourers, but they were too young and inexperienced to earn enough money. The village headman, Ramesh Mondal, wrote to the district magistrate asking for help, but his letter reveals how completely the British had abandoned rural areas to their fate. "The poppy growers are dying like animals," Mondal wrote. "They cannot work their fields, cannot care for their families, cannot even bury their dead properly. The company takes their crop, but provides nothing in return. We are watching an entire way of life disappear before our eyes." The magistrate's response was typical of colonial attitudes. He blamed the farmers for their lack of moral fibre and suggested that the deaths were a natural consequence of native excess. There was no offer of medical assistance, no investigation into the conditions that had created the crisis, and certainly no consideration of reforming the system that was causing so much suffering. This pattern was repeating itself across rural Bengal, creating a cascade of social and economic collapse that fed back into the urban crisis in Calcutta. Farmers who lost their land due to debt or addiction would migrate to the city looking for work, but they arrived already weakened and traumatized, making them easy targets for both opium dealers and disease. The refugee camps that sprang up around Calcutta were incubators for both addiction and cholera. Desperate people crowded together in temporary shelters with no sanitation, no clean water, and no economic opportunities. Opium offered the only available escape from conditions that were literally unbearable. Haradan Sarkar was a blacksmith who lost his village forge when the British imported cheap iron tools from Birmingham. He came to Calcutta with his pregnant wife Malati and their 2 children, hoping to find work in one of the new factories or workshops. But the British preferred to hire workers from their own communities, and Indian craftsmen found themselves competing for the few jobs available at wages that wouldn't support a family. Haradan and his family ended up in a refugee camp near the Hooghly River, living in a shelter made from bamboo poles and torn cloth. Malati gave birth to their 3rd child in that shelter, with no medical assistance and no proper facilities. The baby was sickly from birth, crying constantly, and unable to keep down milk. The stress of trying to care for a sick infant while living in squalid conditions, combined with the humiliation of being unable to provide for his family, drove Haradan to seek escape in the opium dens that had sprung up around the refugee camps. These dens were even more horrible than the ones in established neighborhoods, because they catered to people who had absolutely nothing left to lose. Malati watched her husband disappear into addiction, while she struggled alone to care for their children. The baby died at 3 months old, probably from cholera or dysentery contracted from contaminated water in the camp. Haradan was too drugged to attend his own child's funeral. Within a year, Haradan was dead from a combination of opium poisoning and cholera. Malati found herself a widow with 2 surviving children in a refugee camp with no resources and no prospects. She had become one of thousands of women who were forced to choose between prostitution and starvation, because those were literally the only options available. The British system had created a perfect machine for human destruction. It took people who had been productive farmers and craftsmen, destroyed their traditional livelihoods, forced them into dependence on colonial institutions, addicted them to opium, and then left them to die when disease struck their weakened communities. But what makes this story even more tragic is that some people understood exactly what was happening and tried to fight it. Bengali intellectuals, physicians, and religious leaders attempted to organize resistance to the opium trade and provide alternative support systems for people caught in the crisis. Ram Mohan Roy, the social reformer, had been warning about the dangers of opium addiction since the 1820s. His followers established treatment centers and support networks for addicts, but they were fighting against a system backed by the entire colonial administration and military force. Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar, the educator and social reformer, tried to create alternative economic opportunities for displaced craftsmen and farmers. His schools and workshops provided training in new skills, but they couldn't compete with the scale of economic destruction that British policies were creating. Dr. Mahendra Lal Sircar, whose medical research I mentioned earlier, not only documented the health crisis, but also tried to establish clinics and treatment programs for both opium addiction and cholera. His work saved hundreds of lives, but he was working against a system designed to create thousands of casualties. These reformers faced constant harassment from colonial authorities who saw their work as a threat to British commercial interests. Their clinics were raided, their schools were closed, and their leaders were arrested on trumped-up charges whenever they became too effective at helping people escape the system of exploitation. The British message was clear. Indians were free to destroy themselves with opium, but they were not free to organize effective resistance to the system that was destroying them. Colonial authorities would tolerate any amount of suffering as long as it didn't threaten their profits or their political control. By 1865, the combined impact of opium addiction and cholera had fundamentally transformed Calcutta. Entire neighborhoods had been depopulated. Traditional family structures had collapsed. Local industries had been wiped out. The social fabric that had held Bengali society together for centuries had been torn apart by colonial policies designed to extract maximum profit from human misery. The survivors of this double catastrophe faced a world that no longer made sense. Let me tell you about Broyendranath Seal, a court clerk who witnessed the transformation of his neighborhood from a thriving commercial district into what he called a graveyard where the dead still breathe. Broyendranath lived on Mechua Bazaar Street, which had once been lined with prosperous shops selling textiles, spices, and jewelry. By 1865, half the buildings stood empty, their owners dead or fled. The remaining shops had been converted into opium dens or makeshift cholera hospitals that were really just places where people went to die. "I walk the same streets I have known since childhood," Broyendranath wrote in his diary. "But everything familiar has been replaced by horror. The spice merchant's shop where my mother bought turmeric now houses 20 opium smokers lying on dirty mats. The jewelry store where I bought my wife's wedding bangles is now a morgue where bodies wait for collection." But the most heartbreaking part of Broyendranath's account isn't the physical transformation of his neighborhood. It's his description of how the social bonds that had held the community together simply dissolved under the pressure of mass addiction and disease. "We no longer trust our neighbors," he wrote. "When someone falls ill, we do not know if it is cholera or opium poisoning, and we dare not get close enough to help. When children cry in empty houses, we do not know if their parents are dead or simply lost in narcotic dreams. We have become a community of strangers living among corpses." This social disintegration wasn't accidental. It was the predictable result of a system designed to break down traditional support networks and make people completely dependent on colonial institutions. When families were torn apart by addiction and disease, there was no longer any organized resistance to British exploitation. Consider what happened to the guild system that had protected Bengali craftsmen for centuries. These guilds had provided not just economic support, but also social insurance, helping members through difficult times and ensuring that traditional skills were passed down to the next generation. But when guild members started dying en masse from cholera and addiction, the entire system collapsed. Guhari Das was the head of the Weavers Guild in the Kumartoli area. His guild had once represented over 200 families who made fine cotton cloth for local and regional markets. By 1864, fewer than 30 families remained active, and most of those were struggling with addiction or disease. Guhari tried desperately to hold the guild together, but he was fighting against forces beyond his control. British textile imports had destroyed the market for locally made cloth. Guild members who lost their livelihoods turned to opium as an escape. When cholera struck, the guild's traditional support systems were overwhelmed by the scale of the crisis. "I've been head of this guild for 23 years, Guhari told a British magistrate who was investigating complaints about unpaid taxes. "In all that time, we never failed to support a member's family through illness or hardship. But now we have 30 widows, 40 orphaned children, and 12 men who can no longer recognize their own families because of the poppy smoke. How can a guild function when most of its members are either dead or might as well be?" The magistrate's response reveals the cold calculation behind British policy. Instead of offering assistance or acknowledging the role of colonial exploitation in creating the crisis, he simply dissolved the guild and seized its remaining assets to pay outstanding tax debts. The traditional institution that had protected Bengali weavers for generations was eliminated with a stroke of a pen. This pattern repeated across every sector of Bengali society: trade associations, religious organizations, neighborhood councils, extended family networks. All of these traditional support systems crumbled under the combined assault of economic disruption, mass addiction, and epidemic disease. The destruction of these social institutions had consequences that went far beyond immediate suffering. It meant that knowledge and skills that had been accumulated over centuries were lost forever. Master craftsmen died without passing their techniques to apprentices. Traditional medicine practitioners succumbed to cholera before they could train replacements. cultural traditions that had defined Bengali identity for generations simply disappeared. Let me tell you about Ramdulal Dey, a master carpenter who specialized in creating the intricate wooden decorations for temples and wealthy homes. Ramdulal's family had been practicing this art for 7 generations, and he was training his 3 sons to carry on the tradition. But British architectural preferences and imported building materials had reduced demand for traditional Bengali woodwork. Ramdulal's income dropped so dramatically that he couldn't afford to keep his workshop open. His eldest son, Shamlal, left to work as a day labourer at the docks. His middle son, Gopal, started visiting opium dens to cope with the shame of being unable to practice the craft he had been raised to master. When cholera reached their neighbourhood in 1863, it struck the family like lightning. Ramdulal died within 3 days of showing symptoms. Gopal was too drugged to care for himself and died a week later. Shyamlal survived, but without his father's guidance and his brother's help, he couldn't maintain the workshop or complete the training that would have made him a master craftsman. The art of traditional Bengali wood carving died with Ramdulal's family. Techniques that had been refined over 2 centuries, patterns that had decorated hundreds of temples, skills that had provided livelihoods for dozens of families. All of it vanished because the colonial system had made it impossible for traditional knowledge to survive the transition between generations. This cultural devastation was happening simultaneously across every aspect of Bengali civilization. Musicians, poets, painters, scholars, religious teachers, entire categories of people who had maintained and transmitted Bengali culture were being wiped out by the double catastrophe of addiction and disease. The British weren't just destroying individual lives, they were systematically eliminating the cultural memory that made Bengali society possible. And they were doing it while claiming to bring civilization and progress to a backward people. But some Bengalis understood exactly what was happening and fought back with whatever resources they had left. Debendranath Tagore, father of the famous poet Rabindranath, used his wealth and influence to establish relief programs for families affected by the crisis. His organization provided food, medical care, and temporary shelter for cholera victims and their families. More importantly, Tagore tried to create alternative economic opportunities that would allow Bengalis to survive without participating in the colonial system. He established workshops where displaced craftsmen could learn new skills, schools where children could receive education in Bengali rather than English, and credit societies that provided loans without the crushing terms imposed by British banks. Tagore's efforts saved hundreds of families, but they also revealed the scale of what had been lost. His workshops could train maybe 50 craftsmen, but thousands had already died or been reduced to beggary. His schools could educate perhaps 200 children, but an entire generation had been orphaned by the crisis. The most heartbreaking aspect of Tagore's work was discovering how thoroughly the colonial system had broken people's ability to imagine alternatives. Many of the families he tried to help had become so desperate that they couldn't believe genuine assistance was possible without some hidden exploitation. Nitai Chatterjee was a potter whose family had made clay vessels for the local market until British imports destroyed their business. When Tagore's organization offered to set up a workshop where Nitai could teach pottery skills to young men who had lost their traditional occupations, Nitai initially refused. "What do you want from me in return?" Nitai asked Tagore's representative. "The British give us opium and tell us it will ease our pain, but then they demand everything we own as payment. The moneylenders offer loans and then take our houses when we cannot repay them. Why should I believe that you are different?" It took months of patient work to convince Nitai that some people were genuinely trying to help without exploiting him in return. The colonial system had created such pervasive distrust that even acts of genuine charity were viewed with suspicion. When Nitai finally agreed to participate in the workshop, he proved to be an excellent teacher. His students learned quickly and were soon producing pottery that could compete with British imports in both quality and price. For a brief moment, it seemed like traditional Bengali crafts might survive the colonial onslaught. But then cholera struck the workshop in the summer of 1864. Nitai and 3 of his best students died within days of each other. The remaining students scattered, some returning to their home villages, and others disappearing into the urban chaos of Calcutta. Another attempt to preserve traditional knowledge had been crushed by the epidemic that was stalking everyone who tried to rebuild Bengali society. These small-scale efforts at resistance and reconstruction were happening throughout the city, but they were fighting against forces that seemed almost supernatural in their destructive power. Every time someone tried to create something positive, cholera or addiction would sweep through and destroy their work. Dr. Rajendralal Mitra, a physician and scholar, established a clinic that provided free medical care for opium addicts and cholera victims. He trained local women to serve as nurses and health workers, creating employment opportunities while also building medical capacity in Bengali communities. For 2 years, Dr. Mitra's clinic saved lives and provided hope in neighborhoods where both had become rare commodities. His nurses developed innovative techniques for treating cholera using traditional Bengali medicines combined with modern medical knowledge. His addiction treatment programs helped dozens of men overcome their dependence on opium and return to productive work. But the colonial authorities viewed Dr. Mitra's success as a threat to their control. If Bengalis could solve their own medical problems, they might start questioning why they needed British administration at all. In 1865, colonial officials raided the clinic on the pretext of investigating unlicensed medical practice. They arrested Dr. Mitra, closed his clinic, and scattered his staff. The women he had trained as nurses were forbidden from practicing medicine. The addicts who had been successfully treated were forced back onto the streets with no support system. Within months, most of them had relapsed into addiction or died from cholera. The message was clear. Bengalis would be allowed to suffer, but they would not be allowed to organize effective solutions to their suffering. The colonial system required dependency and desperation to function properly, and any attempt to create genuine alternatives would be crushed. This systematic suppression of Bengali self-help efforts explains why the crisis continued to worsen even as individual families and communities tried desperately to save themselves. Every successful initiative was either co-opted by the colonial administration or destroyed by it. The few Bengali elites who had managed to accumulate wealth within the colonial system faced impossible choices. They could use their resources to help their suffering communities, but doing so would invite repression from the British authorities. Or they could protect their own positions by collaborating more fully with colonial policies, but that meant abandoning their people to destruction. Dwarkanath Tagore, Debendranath's father, had built a fortune by working within the colonial system as a merchant and financier. He used some of his wealth to fund relief efforts, but he also had to maintain business relationships with the same British officials who were profiting from the opium trade. The psychological toll of this contradiction was enormous. Dwarkanath's private letters reveal a man torn between his desire to help his people and his understanding that too much resistance would destroy his ability to help anyone at all. I attend dinner parties with men who count their profits from the misery of my neighbours, he wrote to a friend in 1862. I smile and make polite conversation while they discuss the latest shipments of opium as if they were talking about the weather. I tell myself that I must maintain these relationships so that I can use my influence to help. But sometimes I wonder if I am simply finding excuses for my own complicity. This moral anguish was shared by many Bengali elites who found themselves trapped between their consciences and their circumstances. They had enough education and resources to understand exactly how the colonial system worked, but not enough power to change it significantly. Some tried to find middle ground by focusing on cultural and educational work that the British viewed as less threatening than direct political resistance. They established schools, published newspapers, organized literary societies, and funded cultural events that helped maintain Bengali identity even as Bengali society was being destroyed. But even these seemingly harmless activities came under scrutiny when colonial authorities realized that cultural preservation could become the foundation for political resistance. Schools that taught Bengali history were accused of promoting sedition. Newspapers that reported on social conditions were censored or shut down. Literary societies that discussed traditional values were suspected of planning rebellion. The paranoia of the colonial administration reveals how thoroughly they understood the connection between cultural destruction and political control. They knew that a people who had lost their traditions, their social institutions, and their economic independence would be incapable of effective resistance to colonial rule. This is why the opium and cholera crisis was so useful to British interests. It wasn't just killing people, it was destroying the cultural and social foundations that made organized resistance possible. Every family torn apart by addiction was one less source of potential opposition. Every traditional institution that collapsed under epidemic pressure was one less obstacle to colonial exploitation. The British had discovered that they didn't need to conquer Bengali society through military force. They could simply create conditions that made Bengali society consume itself through addiction and disease, leaving behind a population too broken and demoralized to challenge colonial rule. By 1866, this strategy had succeeded beyond the wildest dreams of its architects. Calcutta had been transformed from a thriving center of Bengali civilization into a colonial extraction zone where human beings existed primarily to generate profits for British merchants and administrators. The few Bengalis who had survived with their dignity and traditions intact found themselves living in a world that seemed designed to punish anyone who refused to participate in their own degradation. They were surrounded by the walking dead, people whose bodies still functioned, but whose spirits had been crushed by the systematic destruction of everything that had once made life meaningful. Yogendranath Bose was a teacher who had managed to keep his small school operating throughout the worst years of the crisis. His students were mostly orphans whose parents had died from cholera or addiction, and Yogendranath tried to give them not just basic literacy, but also some understanding of the Bengali culture they had inherited. "I teach them about our poets and philosophers," Yogendranath wrote in 1866, "but they look at me with empty eyes. They have seen too much death and suffering to believe in beauty or wisdom. They learn their lessons mechanically, but their hearts remain closed to everything except survival." Yogendranath's observations capture something essential about what the colonial system had accomplished. It hadn't just killed people. It had killed the capacity for hope, imagination, and cultural transmission that makes human societies possible. The children who survived the crisis grew up in a world where bonds had been severed by addiction and traditional values had been proven useless, where family death, and where the only successful people were those who had learned to profit from others' misery. These children became adults who had no memory of what Bengali society had been like before the catastrophe, and therefore no vision of what it might become again. This is perhaps the most tragic aspect of the entire story. The British had not only destroyed a generation of Bengalis, they had created conditions that would make it nearly impossible for future generations to rebuild what had been lost. The cultural memory necessary for reconstruction had been systematically eliminated, along with the people who carried it. The opium corpses lying in Calcutta's streets weren't just individual tragedies. They were the visible symbols of a civilization that was being understood exactly how to destroy a people's capacity for self-determination while claiming to help methodically dismantled by forces that them. And the most horrifying part is that this wasn't an accident or an unintended consequence of colonial policy. The British had studied how to break down traditional societies, and they had implemented those techniques with scientific precision. The suffering in Calcutta wasn't a regrettable side effect of economic development. It was the deliberate result of policies designed to create maximum dependency and minimum resistance. The streets filled with opium addicts and cholera victims represented the successful implementation of a system that treated human beings as raw materials to be processed for profit. Every body lying motionless in those alleys was proof that the British had achieved their goal of transforming a proud and ancient civilization into a source of colonial revenue. But what happened next reveals just how calculated this destruction really was. Let me tell you about the correspondence between Lord Canning, the Governor-General, and the Secretary of State for India in London during the worst months of the crisis. These letters, preserved in the India Office records, show that British officials were perfectly aware of what their policies were creating. In a dispatch dated September 1863, Canning wrote, "The mortality among the native population continues at unprecedented levels, but I am pleased to report that opium revenues have increased by 47% over the previous year. The disruption to traditional social structures appears to be facilitating our administrative objectives." Think about the cold-blooded nature of that statement. Canning was literally celebrating the fact that mass death was making colonial rule easier while generating record profits. This wasn't incompetence or negligence. It was genocide disguised as economic policy. The Secretary of State's response was equally chilling. "Your reports on the effectiveness of the current arrangements are most encouraging. The Board of Directors wishes to commend your administration for maintaining revenue streams during what might otherwise have been a period of reduced productivity." These men were discussing human catastrophe in the same language they would use to describe a successful business quarter. Hundreds of thousands of people were dying in agony, and the British response was to congratulate themselves on their profit margins. But let me show you how this systematic cruelty played out at the individual level by telling you about Kishori Mohan Das, a revenue collector who worked for the East India Company in the Hooghly district. Kishori was one of those tragic figures who found himself implementing policies that were destroying his own people. Kishori's job was to collect taxes from villages that were being devastated by the opium and cholera crisis. He would arrive in settlements where half the population was either dead or dying. And he was expected to extract the same revenue as if nothing had changed. When families couldn't pay because their breadwinners were lying unconscious in opium dens, Kishori was instructed to seize their property and sell it at auction. His personal diary reveals the psychological torture of this position. "Today, I took the cooking pots from Radharani's house because her husband owes 3 rupees in land tax," he wrote in October 1863. Her husband has not spoken a coherent word in 2 months because of the poppy smoke, and her 2 children are already showing signs of the wasting disease. But my British supervisor tells me that maintaining revenue collection is essential for the stability of the administration. Kishori understood exactly what he was doing, but he also knew that refusing orders would mean losing his position and condemning his own family to the same fate as his victims. The British had created a system where Indians were forced to participate in their own people's destruction or face destruction themselves. The psychological records from this period show that many Indian collaborators suffered what we would now recognize as severe trauma from the moral contradictions of their positions. Dr. Broyendranath Seal, a Bengali physician who treated both British officials and Indian civil servants, documented numerous cases of what he called administrative melancholia among Indian employees of the colonial government. "They come to me with symptoms of profound despair," Dr. Seal wrote. "They cannot sleep because they dream of the faces of people they have been forced to dispossess. They cannot eat because food reminds them of families they have seen starve. They speak of feeling like they are drowning in a river of blood while being praised by their superiors for their swimming ability." Mike Ilauzem. But the British had anticipated this problem and developed mechanisms to manage it. Indian civil servants who showed signs of moral distress were either transferred to different districts where they wouldn't recognize their victims personally, or they were given increased access to opium as a way of numbing their consciences. This created another layer of tragedy. The very people who might have organized resistance to the colonial system were being systematically drugged into compliance. Kishori Mohan Das eventually started using opium to cope with the guilt of his work. Within a year, he had become one of his own victims, lying unconscious in the same types of dens, where he had seen so many families destroyed. His wife, Kamala Sundari, wrote desperate letters to his British supervisors begging them to help her husband overcome his addiction. The responses reveal the cynical calculation behind colonial personnel policies. Native employees who develop habits of excess must be considered casualties of their own moral weakness, wrote District Magistrate James Morrison. The company cannot be held responsible for individual failures of character. This was the same James Morrison who had been providing opium to stressed Indian civil servants as a management technique. He knew exactly why Kishori had become addicted, but colonial policy required that all responsibility be placed on the victims rather than the system that had victimized them. Kamala Sundari's story illustrates another dimension of the tragedy that was unfolding across Bengal. As Indian men were destroyed by addiction and disease, their wives and daughters faced impossible choices about how to survive in a society where traditional support systems had collapsed. Kamala tried to maintain her household by taking in sewing work, but the market for hand-sewn clothes had been destroyed by British textile imports. She attempted to sell food from her kitchen, but most of her potential customers were too poor to buy anything beyond the most basic necessities. Eventually, she was forced to consider options that would have been unthinkable before the crisis. The British had created a thriving market in human misery, and desperate women like Kamala were being pushed into it by circumstances beyond their control. Prostitution, which had once been limited to specific areas of the city, became a survival strategy for thousands of women whose families had been destroyed by opium and cholera. But even this desperate expedient was controlled by the colonial system. The British had established a licensing system for brothels that was designed to extract maximum revenue while providing minimum protection for the women involved. Licensed brothel operators paid substantial fees to colonial authorities, but they were allowed to operate without any oversight of working conditions or health standards. Kamala eventually found work in one of these licensed establishments, but her letters to her sister in Dhaka reveal the additional horrors that awaited women who entered this world. "The men who come here are not just seeking pleasure," she wrote. "They are fleeing from realities too terrible to face while sober. They bring their opium pipes with them, and they want us to share in their escape from the world. I watch them lie unconscious for hours while I sit beside them, wondering if they will wake up or if I will have to call someone to remove another body." These brothels became another type of opium den, places where addiction and sexual exploitation reinforced each other in an endless cycle of degradation. Women like Kamala found themselves caring for men who were slowly committing suicide while being forced to participate in their own destruction. The health consequences were predictable and devastating. Cholera spread rapidly through these establishments because of the poor sanitation and the concentration of people with compromised immune systems. Opium addiction became endemic among the women who worked there because drugs offered the only escape from conditions that were literally unbearable. Dr. Mahendralal Sarkar, who had documented the medical connections between opium and cholera, also studied the health crisis in Calcutta's sex trade. His findings revealed another dimension of the systematic destruction that colonial policies were creating. "The licensed brothels have become death factories," Dr. Sarkar reported to the Bengal Medical Society in 1864. "The women who work in them die from cholera at rates 3 times higher than the general population. Those who survive cholera often succumb to opium poisoning. Those who survive both frequently die from other diseases related to malnutrition and exhaustion. The average life expectancy of a woman entering this trade is less than 2 years." But Dr. Sarkar's most damning observation concerned the children born in these establishments. "The infants born to opium-addicted mothers show signs of dependency from birth," he wrote. "They cry constantly, cannot feed properly, and often die within weeks. Those who survive display developmental problems that suggest permanent damage to their nervous systems." We are witnessing the creation of a generation that will be incapable of normal human functioning. This represents perhaps the most evil aspect of the entire colonial system. The British weren't just destroying the current generation of Bengalis. They were creating conditions that would damage future generations through addiction, disease, and trauma that would be passed from parents to children. The intergenerational effects of the crisis were already becoming visible by the mid-1860s. Children who had grown up witnessing mass death and social collapse showed patterns of behavior that suggested deep psychological damage. Many were unable to form normal emotional attachments, displayed extreme aggression or withdrawal, and seemed incapable of imagining futures beyond basic survival. Saraswati Devi was a widowed teacher who tried to establish a school for orphan children in the Shambazar area. Her attempts to educate these children revealed the extent of the psychological devastation that the crisis had inflicted on an entire generation. "They sit in my classroom like little ghosts," Saraswati wrote to a friend in Benares. "I try to teach them letters and numbers, but their minds cannot focus on anything except death and hunger. When I tell them stories from our scriptures about gods and heroes, they laugh bitterly like old men who have seen too much of the world's cruelty." Saraswati discovered that many of her students had learned to survive by scavenging through opium dens, stealing from unconscious addicts and stripping valuables from corpses. These children had developed skills that allowed them to navigate the urban nightmare that Calcutta had become. But they had also internalized values that made normal social relationships impossible. "Little Hari, who is only 8 years old, told me yesterday that kindness is a luxury that poor people cannot afford," Saraswati recorded. "When I asked him why he thought this, he explained that kind people die quickly because they share their food with others instead of keeping it for themselves. This child has learned lessons about human nature that no child should ever need to know." The colonial system had succeeded in creating what amounted to a lost generation of Bengali children who had been raised in hell and taught to think of hell as the natural state of the world. These children would grow up to be adults who had no memory of normal family life, no experience with functional social institutions, and no capacity to imagine alternatives to the brutal competition for survival that surrounded them. But the British weren't content to simply destroy Bengali society through addiction and disease. They also implemented educational and cultural policies designed to ensure that any recovery would be impossible by eliminating the knowledge and values necessary for social reconstruction. The colonial education system was explicitly designed to produce Indians who would be useful to British administration, but incapable of independent thought or cultural leadership. Students were forbidden from studying Bengali history, literature, or philosophy. They were taught to view their own traditions as backward superstitions that needed to be replaced by British civilization. Ramtanu Lahiri was a Bengali teacher who tried to resist these policies by secretly teaching traditional subjects alongside the required British curriculum. His experiences reveal how systematically the colonial system worked to destroy Bengali cultural memory. "My students hunger for knowledge about their own heritage," Ramtanu wrote in his diary, "but I must be careful how I feed this hunger. If the British inspectors discover that I am teaching Bengali poetry or discussing our ancient texts, they will close my school and arrest me for promoting sedition." Ramtanu developed elaborate strategies for preserving Bengali culture within the constraints of colonial education. He would teach British history, but emphasize the parallels with Bengali historical experiences. He would assign English literature, but encourage students to notice the similarities with Bengali literary traditions. He would discuss British scientific achievements, but mention the contributions of ancient Indian mathematicians and astronomers. But even these subtle forms of resistance came at enormous personal cost. Ramtanu lived in constant fear of denunciation by students who had been taught to view loyalty to British culture as a virtue. He watched promising young Bengalis graduate from his school only to disappear into the colonial administrative system, where their talents would be used to further exploit their own people. The psychological pressure of this situation eventually broke Ramtanu's health. He developed what his physician diagnosed as nervous exhaustion, but his symptoms suggest what we would now recognize as severe depression and anxiety. By 1865, he was spending his evenings in an opium den near Chitpur Road, trying to forget the daily humiliation of teaching Bengali children to despise their own culture. Ramtanu's collapse represents the fate of many Bengali intellectuals who tried to preserve their cultural heritage under colonial rule. The system was designed to make such preservation psychologically unbearable by forcing people to choose between cultural integrity and physical survival. The few Bengalis who managed to maintain both their dignity and their livelihoods did so by finding ways to appear completely assimilated to British culture while secretly preserving Bengali traditions. But this strategy required extraordinary skill and psychological strength, and most people simply couldn't sustain the constant deception and internal conflict it demanded. Bankim Chandra Chattopadhyay was one of the few who succeeded in this balancing act. He worked as a magistrate for the colonial government while writing novels and essays that celebrated Bengali culture and subtly criticized British rule. But even Bankim paid a heavy psychological price for maintaining this double life. His private letters reveal a man torn between competing loyalties and constantly afraid of being discovered by either side. "I serve the British by day and dream of Bengal by night," he wrote to a trusted friend. "Sometimes I wonder if I am a patriot, disguised as a collaborator, or a collaborator disguised as a patriot. The distinction becomes harder to maintain with each passing year." Bankim's literary work provided inspiration and cultural continuity for Bengalis, who were struggling to maintain their identity under colonial pressure. But his success also highlights how exceptional such achievements were. For every Bankim who managed to preserve and transmit Bengali culture, there were hundreds of potential writers, teachers, and cultural leaders who were destroyed by the system before they could make their contributions. The colonial authorities understood the importance of eliminating potential Bengali leaders, and they developed sophisticated techniques for identifying and neutralizing anyone who showed signs of independent thinking or cultural pride. Promising students were offered scholarships to study in England, where they would be thoroughly indoctrinated in British values before returning to India as colonial administrators. Talented writers and artists were given government positions that required them to produce work that supported colonial policies. Those who refused these offers often found themselves unable to make a living in their chosen fields. Publishers who printed works critical of British rule were shut down. Teachers who emphasized Bengali culture were fired. Artists who depicted traditional themes were denied patronage. The colonial system created a cultural environment where only collaborators could succeed professionally. This systematic suppression of Bengali intellectual and artistic life had consequences that extended far beyond individual careers. It meant that the cultural innovations and social critiques that might have helped Bengali society adapt to changing circumstances were never developed or disseminated. Traditional Bengali society had always depended on a class of intellectuals and artists who interpreted social changes and helped communities develop appropriate responses to new challenges. But the colonial system had effectively eliminated this class by making independent thought economically impossible and politically dangerous. The result was a society that was experiencing unprecedented disruption, but had no intellectual framework for understanding or responding to that disruption. People could see that their world was falling apart, but they had no access to the kind of analysis and guidance that might have helped them develop effective strategies for survival and resistance. This intellectual vacuum made the opium and cholera crisis even more devastating than it might otherwise have been. Communities that might have organized collective responses to the epidemics instead fragmented into individual struggles for survival. Families that might have developed new economic strategies to replace destroyed traditional occupations instead turned to addiction as an escape from problems they couldn't understand or solve. The colonial system had created what amounted to social blindness, a condition where people could experience catastrophic changes, but couldn't develop the conceptual tools necessary to respond effectively to those changes. This blindness made every other form of exploitation easier and more thorough. Dr. Rajkrishna Mukhopadhyay, a physician and social reformer, recognized this problem and tried to address it by establishing discussion groups where educated Bengalis could analyze their situation and develop collective responses. But even these modest efforts at intellectual resistance were quickly suppressed by colonial authorities. We gathered in secret to discuss the causes of our people's suffering, Dr. Mukhopadhyay wrote after his group was disbanded and several members arrested. We wanted to understand why traditional remedies were failing and what new approaches might be more effective. But the British authorities viewed any organized thinking about social problems as a threat to public order. The arrests and harassment that followed the discovery of Dr. Mukhopadhyay's discussion group sent a clear message to other potential organizers. Bengalis would be allowed to suffer, but they would not be allowed to think collectively about their suffering or develop independent solutions to their problems. This, of the most psych prohibition on organized intellectual activity, was ontologically damaging aspects of the entire colonial system. It forced people to face unprecedented challenges with only individual resources, making every problem seem insurmountable and every tragedy seem like personal failure rather than systemic oppression. The isolation and despair that resulted from this intellectual suppression drove many people toward opium as the only available escape from problems that seemed impossible to solve. If you can't understand why your world is falling apart, and you're forbidden from discussing it with others who might help you develop effective responses, then chemical oblivion starts to look like the only rational choice. This is why the opium crisis was so perfectly suited to colonial objectives. It didn't just incapacitate potential resistors. It created a form of incapacitation that people imposed on themselves when they concluded that reality was too painful to experience directly. The British had discovered that they didn't need to imprison their subjects or execute potential rebels. They could simply create social conditions so unbearable that people would voluntarily drug themselves into submission while paying for the privilege of doing so. By 1867, this system had achieved results that exceeded even the most optimistic projections of its designers. Calcutta, which had been the cultural and intellectual center of Bengal for over a century, had been transformed into a city where the living envied the dead and the conscious envied the unconscious. The streets that had once bustled with merchants, scholars, artists, and craftsmen were now populated primarily by opium addicts, cholera victims, and the various categories of people who profited from their misery. The traditional rhythms of Bengali life, the festivals, the cultural celebrations, the community gatherings that had defined the social calendar, had virtually disappeared. Krishnadan Bandyopadhyay, a priest at the Kalighat temple, documented the transformation of religious life during this period. His observations reveal how thoroughly the crisis had penetrated even the most sacred aspects of Bengali culture. The devotees who come to the temple now are not seeking spiritual enlightenment or community fellowship, Krishnadan wrote. They come begging for money to buy opium, or they come to pray for quick death to escape their suffering. The great festivals that once brought thousands of people together in joyous celebration now attract only a few dozen worshippers who look like walking corpses. The decline of religious observance wasn't just a symptom of social disintegration. It was also a cause of further breakdown, because Bengali religious institutions had traditionally provided the social glue that held communities together during difficult times. Temples had served as community centers where people shared information, organized mutual aid, and maintained the cultural traditions that defined their identity. Religious festivals had created opportunities for social bonding and collective celebration that reinforced shared values and community solidarity. When the opium and cholera crisis destroyed these religious and cultural practices, it eliminated one of the primary mechanisms through which Bengali society had historically maintained its coherence and resilience. Communities that had survived centuries of political upheaval and economic disruption, by drawing strength from their religious traditions, found themselves without that source of support just when they needed it most. The colonial authorities understood the importance of religious institutions in maintaining social resistance, and they had deliberately implemented policies designed to undermine Bengali religious life. They imposed taxes on temple properties, restricted religious gatherings, and promoted Christian missionary activity that competed with traditional practices. But they didn't need to actively suppress Bengali religion once the opium and cholera crisis had taken hold. The suffering and social disintegration created by colonial policies had made traditional religious practices seem irrelevant or even cruel to people who were watching their families die in agony. How can I tell a mother whose child is dying of cholera that the gods are benevolent? Krishnadhan asked in one of his diary entries. How can I encourage a father whose son lies unconscious from opium to have faith in divine justice? The suffering around us has become so extreme that traditional consolations sound like mockery. This spiritual crisis was perhaps the most profound aspect of the entire catastrophe. The British hadn't just destroyed Bengali bodies and Bengali institutions. They had created conditions that made Bengali souls question everything they had previously believed about the nature of existence and the possibility of meaning in human life. People who had grown up believing that virtue would be rewarded and suffering would be temporary found themselves living in a world where virtue seemed to guarantee destruction and suffering appeared to be permanent. The cognitive dissonance created by this situation was literally driving people insane. Dr. Haranath Ghosh, who worked at the Calcutta Medical College, documented numerous cases of what he called metaphysical madness among people who had witnessed the worst of the crisis. These patients showed symptoms of severe mental illness that seemed to be triggered not by personal trauma, but by the complete breakdown of their understanding of how the world was supposed to work. They speak coherently about practical matters, Dr. Ghosh noted. But when the conversation turns to questions of meaning or purpose, they become agitated and confused. They seem to have lost the ability to believe that human actions have moral significance, or that individual choices can influence outcomes. This existential despair was spreading through Bengali society like another epidemic, destroying people's capacity for hope and agency, even when they weren't directly affected by opium addiction or cholera. The colonial system had succeeded in creating a form of spiritual death that was almost more devastating than physical death, because it eliminated the psychological resources that people needed to resist their oppression or rebuild their lives. The British had discovered that the most effective way to control a population wasn't to eliminate their bodies, but to eliminate their souls, their capacity for collective action, their belief in the possibility of justice, their ability to imagine alternatives to their current circumstances. And they had accomplished this soul murder through the simple expedient of creating social conditions so horrific that normal human psychology couldn't process them without breaking down. The opium addicts lying motionless in Calcutta's streets weren't just victims of a drug epidemic. They were visible symbols of an entire civilization that had been psychologically destroyed by a system designed to make human dignity impossible. This is the true horror of what happened in Victorian Calcutta. It wasn't just a tragic accident or an unfortunate side effect of economic development. It was the successful implementation of a program designed to eliminate a people's capacity for self-determination by destroying their ability to believe that self-determination was possible. The British had achieved something that military conquest alone could never have accomplished. They had created a system so perfectly calibrated to human destruction that their victims would literally pay for their own annihilation while believing they were making rational choices about survival. But let me show you just how calculated this destruction really was by taking you inside the mind of someone who helped design it. Sir William Muir was a colonial administrator who spent 15 years in Bengal developing what he called population management strategies. His private journals, discovered in family papers decades later, reveal the cold scientific precision behind policies that destroyed hundreds of thousands of lives. The native population requires careful regulation, Muir wrote in 1861. Direct suppression creates martyrs and inspires resistance, but indirect methods that encourage self-destructive behaviors while appearing to offer relief from suffering achieve the same objectives without generating sympathy for the victims. Muir was describing a form of warfare that targeted not bodies, but minds, not armies, but entire civilizations. He had studied how to make genocide look like personal choice, how to transform systematic murder into what appeared to be individual moral failure. His journals detail conversations with other colonial officials about the most effective techniques for social destruction. Morrison believes that economic pressure alone will suffice, Muir noted after a dinner party in 1862. But I maintain that combining economic desperation with readily available chemical escape creates a more thorough and permanent solution. Think about the terminology he's using. Solution. As if the existence of Bengali civilization was a problem that needed to be solved through carefully calibrated human suffering. Muir's approach worked exactly as he intended. By 1867, the combination of economic devastation and opium availability had created what he called a self-sustaining cycle of population reduction. People were destroying themselves faster than any military campaign could have destroyed them, and they were paying British merchants for the privilege. The few Bengalis who understood what was happening found themselves in an impossible position. Girish Chandra Ghosh was a playwright and intellectual who recognized the systematic nature of the destruction around him. His attempts to warn his community reveal both the clarity of his analysis and the hopelessness of his situation. "We are being consumed by a machine designed for our consumption," Girish wrote in a letter to his brother in 1865. Every part of this system serves the same purpose: to transform Bengali lives into British profits. The opium dealers, the cholera outbreaks, the economic policies that force us into desperation, they all work together like gears in a clock designed to count down to our extinction. But Girish discovered that even people who were dying from the system refused to believe his analysis. They had been so thoroughly conditioned to blame themselves for their suffering that they couldn't accept the possibility that their destruction was being orchestrated by forces beyond their control. When Girish tried to organize community meetings to discuss collective responses to the crisis, he found that people were literally incapable of thinking in collective terms anymore. The combination of trauma, addiction, and social fragmentation had reduced most of his neighbors to a purely individual focus on day-to-day survival. "I tell them we are all drowning in the same poisoned river," Girish recorded after one failed meeting. But each person believes his drowning is a personal failure of swimming technique. They cannot see the hands that are holding them underwater because they are too busy blaming themselves for sinking. This psychological condition wasn't accidental. British colonial theorists had studied the mental states that made populations easiest to control, and they had deliberately implemented policies designed to produce those states in subject populations. Dr. James Mill, the philosopher and East India Company official, had written extensively about what he called the psychology of efficient administration. His theories provided the intellectual framework that administrators like Muir used to design their population control strategies. A people who blame themselves for systemic oppression will never organize effective resistance to that oppression, Mill had written. The key to permanent control lies not in suppressing rebellion, but in making rebellion psychologically impossible by convincing subjects that their suffering is self-inflicted. The opium and cholera crisis was the practical application of these theories on an unprecedented scale. Every addict lying unconscious in the streets was proof that Mill's ideas worked exactly as intended. But let me take you deeper into this nightmare by showing you what it felt like to watch your own family disappear into this machine of destruction. Harinath Majumdar was a court translator who earned enough money to keep his household fed and secure, but even middle-class families weren't safe from the forces that were consuming Bengali society. Harinath's younger brother, Manmatha, had been a talented musician who performed at weddings and religious festivals throughout the Calcutta area, but British cultural policies had systematically undermined traditional Bengali arts by promoting European music and theatre, while restricting funding for local performers. Manmatha watched his income shrink year after year as wealthy Bengali families began hiring British musicians for their celebrations, instead of supporting local artists. The colonial administration actively encouraged this trend by imposing licensing fees on traditional performers while exempting European entertainers from the same requirements. "My brother's flute once brought joy to hundreds of families," Harinath wrote in his diary. "Children would gather around him during festivals, their faces bright with wonder as he played the old songs that connected them to their grandparents and their heritage. But now those same families hire British musicians who play melodies that mean nothing to anyone but sound fashionable to ears that have learned to despise their own culture." The psychological impact of this cultural displacement was devastating for artists like Manmatha, who had devoted their lives to preserving and transmitting Bengali traditions. They weren't just losing income, they were watching their life's work become irrelevant in their own homeland. Manmatha fell into depression as his bookings disappeared and his art became unwanted. He would sit in his room for hours, playing his flute to empty air while his family worried about his mental state. The music that had once connected him to his community now served only to remind him of everything he had lost. When a friend suggested that opium might help ease his emotional pain, Manmatha was too broken to resist. The drug offered temporary relief from the crushing weight of cultural extinction that he carried everywhere he went. Manmatha says that opium makes him forget that his music no longer matters, Harinath recorded. He can play the old songs in his mind while the drug flows through his blood. And for a few hours, he can pretend that Bengali culture still has value in Bengali hearts. But what started as occasional escape quickly became daily necessity. Within months, Manmatha was spending entire days in opium dens, playing imaginary concerts for audiences that existed only in his drugged fantasies. Harinath tried desperately to help his brother recover, but he was fighting against forces much larger than family loyalty or personal will. The colonial system had created conditions that made traditional support mechanisms useless and traditional values seem naive. "I take Manmatha to the temple, hoping that religious devotion will give him strength to resist the drug," Harinath wrote. "But the priest tells me that 3 of his own sons have succumbed to the same affliction. I take him to the physician, but Dr. Sen says he treats a dozen new opium cases every week and has no cure to offer. I take him to the family elders, but they shake their heads and say they no longer understand the world we live in. Every institution that might have provided support for Manmatha's recovery had been compromised by the same crisis that had destroyed his livelihood. The temples were struggling with their own addicted members. The physicians were overwhelmed by the scale of the problem. The community leaders were as confused and helpless as everyone else. When cholera reached their neighborhood in the summer of 1866, Manmatha was lying unconscious in a den on College Street. Harinath searched for 3 days before finding his brother among the rows of motionless bodies that filled the establishment. "I could not tell if he was breathing until I put my ear to his chest and heard his heart beating like a bird trapped in a cage," Harinath recorded. His skin was grey as ash, his eyes had rolled back until only the whites were visible, and his body felt cold despite the summer heat. Harinath carried his brother home and tried to nurse him back to health, but Manmatha had been weakened by months of malnutrition and drug abuse. When cholera symptoms appeared, his body had no resources left to fight the disease. Manmatha died delirious, calling out names of people who had attended his concerts years earlier. asking them to wait while he finished playing songs that existed only in his fading memory. His last words were lyrics from a traditional Bengali song about the eternal nature of art and the temporary nature of human suffering. The irony was unbearable, Harinath wrote after his brother's funeral. Manmatha died believing in the permanence of beauty, while everything beautiful in our world was being systematically destroyed by people who saw beauty as an obstacle to profit. But Manmatha's death was just the beginning of Harinath's family's destruction. His wife, Kamala, had been caring for Manmatha during his final illness and contracted cholera from exposure to his contaminated bedding and clothing. Kamala fought the disease for 6 days, burning with fever while her body expelled every drop of fluid she consumed. Harinath sat beside her bed, watching helplessly as the woman who had been his partner for 15 years slowly dehydrated, despite his desperate attempts to make her drink water and rice gruel. On the 7th day, Kamala's fever broke, but she had been so weakened by the illness that she could barely speak above a whisper. "Take care of Meera," she told Harinath, referring to their 12-year-old daughter. "Don't let this place destroy her the way it has destroyed us." Kamala died that evening, leaving Harinath alone with their daughter in a world that seemed designed to consume everything he loved. He tried to maintain his work as a translator, but concentration became impossible when every legal document he processed reminded him of the system that had killed his wife and brother. "I translate British laws that protect British property while Bengali families are dying in the streets," Harinath wrote. "I help enforce regulations that generate revenue for the very people who have created the conditions that murdered my family. Every word I write in service to this administration is a betrayal of everyone I have lost." The psychological pressure of this contradiction drove Harinath toward the same escape that had claimed his brother. He began visiting opium dens after work, telling himself he just needed temporary relief from the grief and guilt that consumed his waking hours. Little Meera watched her father follow the same path that had destroyed her uncle. She was too young to understand the larger forces at work, but old enough to recognize the pattern of decline that had already taken everyone else she loved. "Papa sits in the corner and stares at nothing," Meera confided to her neighbor, an elderly widow named Shyama, who had somehow survived the worst of the crisis. "He talks to Mama and Uncle as if they are still here, but when I speak to him, he looks at me like he doesn't know who I am." Shyama had seen this pattern repeated in dozens of families throughout their neighborhood. The colonial system had perfected a technique for destroying people in sequence, using the grief and desperation created by each death to drive survivors toward behaviors that would ensure their own destruction. "The machine feeds on itself," Shyama told a social worker who was documenting conditions in their area. "It kills the father, which breaks the mother, which orphans the children, who grow up broken and have broken children of their own. Each generation is weaker than the last until there is nothing left to destroy." But Sharma also understood something that many younger people had forgotten. The destruction wasn't inevitable, and it wasn't permanent. She had lived through the earlier stages of colonial penetration into Bengal, and she remembered a time when Bengali society had possessed the resources and institutions necessary to protect its members from systematic exploitation. "We once had ways of helping families through difficult times," Sharma told the social worker. "Extended family networks that shared resources when individual households faced problems, caste associations that provided support for their members, village councils that organized collective responses to threats, religious institutions that offered both material assistance and spiritual guidance. Few. All of these traditional support systems had been systematically undermined by colonial policies designed to make individuals completely dependent on British-controlled institutions. The British had understood that people who could rely on their own communities for help would be much harder to exploit than people who had nowhere to turn except colonial authorities. Sharma had watched this process unfold over decades, but she had also developed strategies for preserving some elements of traditional mutual aid, even under colonial conditions. She quietly organized networks of women who shared information about which neighborhoods were safe, which employers could be trusted, and which colonial officials could be bribed or reasoned with. These informal networks couldn't stop the larger catastrophe that was consuming Bengali society, but they did save individual lives and preserve fragments of social knowledge that might be useful if circumstances ever improved. When Harinath's addiction reached the point where he was spending entire days unconscious in opium dens, Sharma took responsibility for little Meera without being asked. She understood that the child represented one of the few hopes for cultural continuity in a world where most connections to the past had been severed. Meera carries her grandfather's eyes and her grandmother's voice, Shyama explained to another neighbor who questioned why she was taking on the burden of raising someone else's child. If we can keep her alive and teach her to remember what our people were like before this darkness fell over us, then perhaps something of value will survive to see better times. Mom. But even Sharma's efforts were constantly threatened by the conditions that surrounded them. Meera was growing up in a world where death was commonplace, where adults regularly lost their capacity for rational thought, and where basic survival required skills that no child should need to learn. The little girl had learned to recognize the difference between people who were sleeping and people who were unconscious from opium. She could identify the early symptoms of cholera and knew which streets to avoid when disease was spreading through particular neighborhoods. She could negotiate with opium den operators to retrieve unconscious relatives and could calculate how long someone could survive without food or water. These were not normal childhood skills. They were survival techniques developed by someone who had been forced to navigate an environment designed to kill anyone who made mistakes or showed weakness. Meera talks like an old woman who has seen too much of life's cruelty, Shyama observed. She never plays games or laughs at silly things the way children should. When I tell her stories about the gods and heroes, she asks practical questions about how they managed to eat and find shelter while having their adventures. The colonial system had succeeded in creating a generation of children who had been psychologically aged beyond their years by exposure to systematic horror. These children would grow up to be adults who had never experienced normal human development and therefore had no template for creating normal human relationships or communities. But some children proved more resilient than the system's designers had anticipated. Meera began showing signs of unusual intellectual curiosity and emotional strength that suggested she might be capable of preserving and transmitting cultural knowledge despite everything she had witnessed. She would ask Shyama detailed questions about life before the crisis, memorizing stories and songs and traditions that were disappearing as their carriers died. She showed particular interest in learning about the social institutions that had once protected Bengali families and communities. "Tell me again about the festivals," Meera would ask. Not just what happened during them, but how people organized them. Who decided when they would occur? How did families coordinate their preparations? What happened if someone couldn't afford to participate? These weren't the questions of a child seeking entertainment. They were the questions of someone trying to understand how human communities functioned so that she might someday help rebuild what had been destroyed. Sharma recognized the significance of Meera's curiosity and began treating her as a repository for cultural memory rather than just another child to be protected. She introduced Meera to other elderly people who remembered the old ways, creating informal education networks that operated completely outside colonial institutions. "We are like monks copying manuscripts while barbarians burn the libraries," Sharma told her collaborators. "We cannot save everything, but we can preserve enough fragments to make reconstruction possible if the darkness ever lifts." This secret preservation work was happening throughout Bengal, carried out by people who understood that cultural survival required active resistance to colonial policies designed to eliminate Bengali memory and identity. But the work was incredibly dangerous because colonial authorities viewed any organized effort to maintain Bengali culture as a form of political resistance. People who were caught teaching traditional subjects or organizing cultural activities faced imprisonment, fines, or worse. Ramesh Chandra Dutt was a retired government official who had spent his career working within the colonial system but had never lost his commitment to Bengali culture. After retiring, he began secretly teaching Sanskrit and Bengali literature to young people whose formal education had been limited to British-approved subjects. Ramesh conducted his classes in different locations each week, moving between private homes, abandoned buildings, and secluded areas outside the city. Students would arrive individually at staggered times to avoid attracting attention from colonial authorities or their informants. "We study by candlelight like conspirators planning revolution," one of Ramesh's students wrote years later. In a sense, that is exactly what we were doing. We were plotting the revolution of memory against forgetting, of culture against barbarism, of human dignity against systematic degradation. But even these careful precautions couldn't protect the group indefinitely. In 1868, colonial police raided one of Ramesh's classes and arrested everyone present. The students were sentenced to 6 months in prison for participation in unlawful assembly. Ramesh himself received 2 years of hard labor for promoting seditious activities. The message was clear. Bengalis could suffer and die in whatever numbers colonial policies produced, but they would not be permitted to maintain the cultural resources that might enable them to understand their suffering or develop effective responses to it. This prohibition on cultural preservation was perhaps the most evil aspect of the entire colonial system. It wasn't enough for the British to destroy Bengali lives and communities. They also had to ensure that the destruction would be permanent by eliminating the knowledge and traditions that might someday enable recovery. The opium addicts, lying motionless in Calcutta's streets, weren't just victims of a drug epidemic. They were symbols of a comprehensive program designed to eliminate an entire civilization's capacity for self-renewal and resistance. By 1869, this program had achieved results that exceeded even its architects' expectations. The Bengali society that had produced philosophers, poets, scientists, and social reformers for over a millennium had been reduced to a population of traumatized survivors, competing desperately for the resources necessary to postpone their own destruction. The few institutions that remained functional existed only to serve colonial interests. Schools taught British values and British history. Hospitals treated diseases, but ignored the colonial policies that created those diseases. Courts enforced British law while criminalizing Bengali customs and traditions. Even Bengali families had been restructured to serve colonial purposes. Traditional extended family networks had been replaced by nuclear units that were easier to control and exploit. Children were educated to view their parents' values as backward obstacles to progress. Parents were encouraged to see their children's success in terms of how well they could assimilate to British culture. Jogendranath Sen was a wealthy merchant who had accumulated his fortune by serving as an intermediary between British companies and Bengali suppliers. His success had come at the cost of collaborating in the destruction of traditional Bengali commerce, but he told himself he was protecting his family by working within the colonial system. By 1869, Yogendranath had achieved everything that colonial society defined as success. He owned a large house in the fashionable Ballygunga area. His children attended British schools, and his business partnerships with European firms generated substantial profits. But success within the colonial system required constant betrayal of Bengali interests, and the psychological cost of this betrayal eventually became unbearable. Yogendranath began drinking heavily and visiting opium dens where he could temporarily escape the guilt of his complicity in his own people's destruction. "I have become wealthy by helping foreigners steal from my neighbours," Yogendranath confessed to his diary in a moment of clarity. "My success is built on the bones of Bengali craftsmen whose livelihoods I helped destroy." My children speak English better than Bengali and think of Britain as their motherland, while their actual mother tongue dies in the streets outside our comfortable home. The irony was that even people who had successfully navigated the colonial system found themselves ultimately consumed by the same forces that had destroyed their less fortunate neighbours. Wealth and status provided temporary protection, but they couldn't shield anyone from the psychological destruction that came from participating in systematic genocide. Yogendranath's eldest son, Surendranath, had been educated at British schools and trained to think of himself as a modern Indian who had transcended the backward traditions of his ancestors. But when he returned from university in London, he found himself living in a world that no longer made sense to him. I was taught that British civilization would bring progress and prosperity to India, Surendranath wrote to a friend. But I returned to find my homeland populated by walking corpses who have been driven mad by the very civilization that was supposed to save them. The prosperity exists, but it belongs entirely to our oppressors, while our people have been reduced to a state worse than slavery. The cognitive dissonance between what Surendranath had been taught about colonialism and what he observed in colonial reality drove him towards the same chemical escape that was consuming thousands of other young Bengalis who couldn't reconcile their education with their experience. Within 2 years of returning from London, Surendranath was spending his days in the same opium dens where his father went to escape the guilt of collaboration. The colonial education system had successfully produced another victim who was psychologically incapable of functioning in the world that colonialism had created. This was the ultimate perfection of British colonial strategy in Bengal. They had created conditions that destroyed people who resisted their rule, people who collaborated with their rule, and people who tried to ignore their rule altogether. Every possible response to colonial exploitation led eventually to the same destination: physical and psychological annihilation. The streets of Calcutta in 1870 were filled with the products of this comprehensive system of human destruction. Opium addicts who had once been farmers, craftsmen, scholars, and merchants lay unconscious in doorways, their bodies slowly consuming themselves while their minds floated in chemical dreams that offered the only escape from unbearable reality. These weren't just individual tragedies or personal failures. They were the predictable outcomes of policies designed by people who understood exactly what those policies would produce. Every unconscious body represented a successful application of colonial theory to the practical problem of eliminating a population's capacity for resistance and self-determination. The cholera outbreaks that continued to sweep through these communities of weakened and immobilized people weren't natural disasters. They were the inevitable consequence of creating conditions where disease could spread unchecked through populations that had been systematically deprived of the resources necessary to protect themselves. Dr. Kedarnath Datta was one of the few Bengali physicians who survived the worst years of the crisis with his conscience and analytical capacity intact. His medical records from this period provide a clinical perspective on what amounted to scientifically designed genocide. The patients I treat show symptoms that cannot be explained by individual pathology, Dr. Datta wrote in a report that colonial authorities tried to suppress. Their illnesses result from systematic exposure to conditions that no human constitution can withstand indefinitely. The opium addiction, the cholera outbreaks, the malnutrition, the psychological trauma, these are not separate problems, but interconnected elements of a single mechanism designed to produce maximum human destruction with minimum administrative effort. Dr. Datta had identified the essential insight that colonial authorities wanted to keep hidden. The suffering in Bengal wasn't accidental or inevitable. It was the engineered product of policies implemented by people who understood exactly what they were creating and why they were creating it. The British had perfected a form of warfare that targeted not just enemy soldiers, but entire populations, not just military resistance, but social and cultural existence itself. They had learned how to eliminate civilizations without appearing to wage war against them. The opium corpses filling Calcutta's streets were casualties of this new form of warfare, a conflict fought not with guns and cannons, but with economic policies, cultural suppression, and chemical weapons disguised as consumer products. And the most horrifying aspect of this warfare was that it made its victims complicit in their own destruction. People weren't being killed by foreign soldiers. They were killing themselves with foreign drugs while paying foreign merchants for the privilege of doing so. This was the ultimate achievement of colonial science, the creation of a system so perfectly calibrated to human psychology that its victims would choose their own annihilation while believing they were making rational decisions about survival and comfort. By 1870, this system had transformed Bengal from one of the world's most prosperous and culturally sophisticated regions into a landscape of walking dead, where the living envied the dead, and consciousness itself had become a form of torture that only chemical oblivion could relieve. The British had succeeded in creating their perfect colony, a population too broken to resist, too addicted to organize, too traumatized to imagine alternatives, and too profitable to spare. But the horror of this systematic destruction becomes even clearer when you see how it played out in the lives of people who tried to document what was happening around them. Let me tell you about Pabani Charan Bandyopadhyay, a court clerk who kept meticulous records of the deaths in his neighborhood during the worst months of 1870. Pabani lived on Beedon Street, in a 3-story building that housed 12 families before the crisis began. His daily entries read like a census of extinction. March 2nd, 1870. Nityananda Das found dead in the courtyard, opium pipe still in his hand. His wife, Radharani, died of cholera 3 days ago. Their son, Gopal, aged 9, now lives with the widow Kamala on the 2nd floor. But Pabani's records reveal something even more disturbing than individual deaths. They show how the British had created a perfect feedback loop where each tragedy created conditions for additional tragedies. When Nityananda died, his family's income disappeared. When Radharani contracted cholera while caring for her addicted husband, she had no money for medical treatment. When little Gopal was orphaned, he became another mouth to feed in a household that was already struggling to survive. Within 6 months, the widow Kamala, who had taken in Gopal, was selling her cooking utensils to buy food. Within a year, she was working in one of the licensed brothels near the docks. Within 18 months, she was dead from a combination of opium poisoning and what was probably syphilis. Gopal, now 11 years old, found himself alone on the streets of a city where children either learned to survive through crime and exploitation or they simply disappeared. Pabani's last entry about the boy reads, "Gopal seen begging near the Howrah station. Looks like he hasn't eaten in days. When I offered him rice, he asked if I had opium instead. He said the hunger hurts less when he smokes." This transformation of children into premature adults obsessed with chemical escape wasn't happening by accident. Colonial authorities had studied how to create conditions that would produce exactly these outcomes. They understood that children raised in systematic horror would grow up incapable of the kind of organized resistance that had challenged British rule in earlier periods. Sir Charles Eliot, who served as Lieutenant Governor of Bengal during the worst years of the crisis, wrote frankly about these strategies in correspondence with London. The current generation of native children is being shaped by circumstances that will render them permanently incapable of political coordination, Eliot reported in 1871. They are learning survival skills appropriate to individual competition rather than collective action. This should prove advantageous to administrative stability in future decades. Eliot was describing what amounted to psychological warfare against children, a deliberate effort to ensure that the next generation of Bengalis would lack the mental and emotional resources necessary for effective resistance to colonial rule. But some children proved more resilient than the colonial planners had anticipated. Satyendranath Bose was 13 years old when his parents died within a week of each other, his father from opium poisoning and his mother from cholera. Instead of succumbing to despair or addiction, Satyendranath developed an almost scientific curiosity about the forces that were destroying his community. He would walk through the opium dens, taking mental notes about the physical and psychological effects of prolonged drug use. He observed how cholera spread through different neighborhoods and tried to identify patterns in the outbreak locations. Most remarkably, he began connecting these observations to the economic and political policies he heard adults discussing when they thought children weren't listening. "The British bring the opium from Patna," Satyendranath wrote in a diary he started after his parents' death. "They sell it through licensed dealers who pay taxes to the colonial government. The dealers are mostly Indians, but they work for British companies. When people become addicted, they sell everything to buy more opium, which makes them poorer. When they become poor, they move to crowded areas with bad water. When cholera comes to these areas, many people die. But the opium trade continues because new customers replace the dead ones." This analysis, written by a 13-year-old orphan, was more accurate than most of the official reports produced by colonial administrators with university educations and decades of experience. Satyendranath had grasped the essential mechanics of systematic oppression simply by observing his environment with clear eyes and logical thinking. His insights might have formed the foundation for organized resistance if he had been able to share them with other people capable of acting on such information. But the colonial system had fragmented Bengali society so thoroughly that isolated individuals like Satyendranath couldn't connect with potential collaborators, even when they existed. The few adults who might have recognized the value of his analysis were either dead, addicted, or too traumatized to engage in abstract thinking about social problems. The institutions that might have provided forums for such discussions had been destroyed or co-opted by colonial authorities. Satyendranath found himself in the bizarre position of understanding exactly how his world was being destroyed, while being powerless to communicate that understanding to anyone who could use it effectively. His diary became a record of one brilliant young mind's futile attempt to make sense of systematic insanity. "I know why we are dying," he wrote in one entry, "but knowing changes nothing. It is like being able to see clearly while drowning in a river of mud. The clarity makes the drowning more horrible, not less." This sense of helpless clarity was shared by many Bengalis who possess the education and analytical ability to understand colonial exploitation, but lacked the resources or connections necessary to organize effective resistance. They could see the machine that was consuming their people, but they couldn't reach the controls that might shut it down. Dr. Mahesh Chandra Nyayaratna was a Sanskrit scholar and social reformer who had spent decades studying British colonial policies and their effects on Bengali society. By 1871, he had developed a comprehensive understanding of how economic exploitation, cultural suppression, and deliberate addiction were working together to destroy his civilization. His unpublished manuscript, The Anatomy of Cultural Murder, provided a detailed analysis of colonial strategies that wouldn't be matched by academic scholars until the 20th century. But Dr. Nayaratna's insights remained locked in his private study because any attempt to publish or disseminate such analysis would have resulted in immediate arrest and imprisonment. "I have spent my life studying the diseases that afflict human societies," Dr. Nyayaratna wrote in his introduction. "But I have discovered a form of pathology so advanced that it makes its own treatment impossible. The patient has been infected with a condition that destroys the very organs necessary for healing." He was describing the ultimate perfection of colonial control, a system that eliminated not just resistance, but the capacity for resistance, not just opposition, but the ability to imagine opposition. Dr. Nayaratna's analysis showed how the British had learned from earlier colonial experiences where subject populations had eventually organized successful rebellions. In Bengal, they had implemented preventive measures designed to ensure that such organization would never become possible. The opium trade served multiple functions in this strategy. Obviously, it generated enormous profits that helped fund colonial administration and military operations. But more importantly, it created a population of addicts who were physically and psychologically incapable of sustained political action. Addicts couldn't attend meetings because they were unconscious for most of each day. They couldn't maintain commitments because their primary loyalty was to their drug supply. They couldn't think strategically because opium impaired the cognitive functions necessary for complex planning. Even recovering addicts remained psychologically damaged in ways that made them unreliable collaborators in any organized effort. The trauma of addiction and withdrawal left most people focused entirely on day-to-day survival, with no mental or emotional energy available for broader social concerns. The cholera outbreaks served similar functions by creating communities of traumatized survivors who were too focused on immediate survival to engage in political organizing. People who had watched their families die in agony, who lived in constant fear of disease, who knew that any social gathering might become a vector for deadly infection, were not going to risk their lives attending secret meetings or planning resistance activities. The British had created what Dr. Nayaratna called a self-maintaining system of population control. Each element reinforced the others to produce a stable condition of social paralysis that required minimal administrative effort to maintain. They have solved the ancient problem of ruling unwilling subjects, Dr. Nayaratna concluded, by creating subjects who are no longer capable of unwillingness in any meaningful sense. But even Dr. Nayaratna's brilliant analysis couldn't capture the full horror of what was happening in Bengal, because some aspects of the destruction were too extreme for rational description. Let me tell you about Krishnakanta Nandi, a shopkeeper who witnessed something that revealed just how completely the colonial system had perverted normal human relationships. Krishnakanta owned a small grocery store in the Shambazar area, and his customers included many of the local opium addicts who would occasionally emerge from their stupors long enough to buy rice or dal. In the autumn of 1871, he noticed that a particular family seemed to be disappearing member by member. The family consisted of Ramkrishna Ghosh, his wife Sushila, and their 3 children. Ramkrishna had been a weaver until British textile imports destroyed his livelihood, and he had turned to opium as an escape from the humiliation of unemployment and poverty. Krishnakanta first noticed the family when Sushila started coming to his shop to buy smaller and smaller quantities of food, paying with items that had obviously been taken from their household. First she sold brass cooking utensils, then silver jewellery, then clothing, then furniture. By early 1872, Sushila was selling her children's clothes to buy rice for the family, while Ramkrishna lay unconscious in an opium den for days at a time. The children, ages 7, 9 and 12, were slowly starving, while their father spent the family's survival money on drugs. But the horror of this situation became even worse when cholera reached their neighbourhood in March of 1872. Sushila contracted the disease while caring for neighbours who had fallen ill, and she died within 4 days of showing symptoms. With their mother dead and their father unconscious from opium, the 3 children were left completely alone. The 12-year-old, a girl named Kamala, tried to care for her younger brothers while also attempting to wake their father and make him understand what had happened. Krishnakanta watched this tragedy unfold from his shop window, but he was afraid to intervene directly because cholera was still spreading through the neighbourhood, and anyone who helped infected families risked contracting the disease themselves. The streets of Calcutta by 1872 had become a testament to the most successful genocide in human history, one so perfectly designed that its victims paid for their own destruction while believing they were making rational choices about survival. What happened in those opium-soaked alleys wasn't just a drug epidemic or a disease outbreak. It was the systematic elimination of an entire civilization, carried out with scientific precision by people who understood exactly what they were creating. Today, when we walk through any modern city dealing with addiction or public health crises, we're witnessing echoes of the same forces that turned Calcutta into a graveyard for the living. The methods have evolved, but the underlying logic remains unchanged. Create conditions so unbearable that people will choose their own destruction while generating profits for those who control the system. The British didn't just kill Bengalis. They perfected a form of warfare that made entire populations complicit in their own annihilation, and that knowledge didn't disappear when the colonial period ended. Understanding this history isn't just about honouring the memory of those who died in those streets. It's about recognising the patterns of systematic destruction that continue to shape our world today.